So who am I? I'm Wasim. I'm a senior technical architect at TELUS. And if you want to find me online, my handle is wascloud, and that's my handle for everything. So you can find me, GitHub, Twitter, Instagram. So I think a lot of people who are from Canada probably know what TELUS is and who TELUS is, sorry. But if you're outside, I know a lot of people are traveling in from the States and other places. But TELUS is a telecommunications company. In Ontario, they mainly focus on the mobile phone business. That's kind of the largest part of the business in Ontario. But being a telco outside of Ontario, we are involved in other things such as internet, TV, and it's really interesting actually, because if you look into the history of the mergers and acquisitions, you'll find out that it's actually over 100 years old, which is kind of cool. I found that out fairly recently. And we've recently expanded into other areas, including home security, health, which is really exciting, and IoT. What some people also may not know is TELUS is international, and they have some branches outside of Canada that deal with a whole bunch of other things like global contact centers and such. But I am part of TELUS Digital, and TELUS Digital is it used to be a small arm within TELUS, and we used to be a product team and just owned a couple of different products. But we have since then started to become champions of introducing new ideas and tools and processes across TELUS. And what we try to say is that digital is not any one app or team or product, but rather it's a way of working. And essentially our mission is to digitize TELUS. So I joined TELUS at the end of 2013. And then at the beginning of 2014, we were about 60 team members. So being 60 team members, pretty easy to fit everyone in a large-ish room. And when you think of even developers, it was definitely easy to fit all the developers in a single room. And when we needed to make technical decisions, we could just hold a meeting, and it didn't matter what type of developer you were, whether you're a UI or API, DevOps, security. You could just hold a meeting and make these technical decisions. And the team structure or the organizational model that we followed was a typical one called the Center of Excellence, where you essentially have these high-level specialties grouped together. This is very standard. And when you think of it from a development point of view, you had all the API, UI, DevOps developers, security, all together. We had a single dev manager, and we would use our weekly meetings to discuss best practices. So 2 years later, in 2016, we grew to about 200 people. And all of a sudden, these processes that we were familiar with, all of a sudden became harder. We could no longer meet in a room. We couldn't meet as a whole TELUS Digital, and let alone, it was pretty difficult to gather about 60 or so developers in a room to discuss something. And then fast forward to today, we're about 435 people. We have hundreds of code bases that span UIs, APIs, and it can be difficult to make decisions. If you look at products from teams that are literally sitting right next to each other, you would see things like this. You'd see small variances in both the UI, the API, and if you even stepped outside of the code bases of digital that were kind of on our platform but not directly made by us, the differences were even more apparent. The problem started because when digital first started, everyone was kind of going their own way. We had varied tools and practices, and it was really, really difficult to reuse work, share ideas, or even receive, consume code updates. Yeah, it was a little bit of a mess. And the question becomes, how do you manage change? The question, how do you manage change? How do you continue to innovate, especially when you're spending most of your time just trying to manage these changes? A lot of these problems have actually been solved in the open source world. And we can actually take a look at a lot of the best practices in that world to see how we can run things in our own companies. So I'm sure a lot of people in this room are familiar with open source. It's especially in the area of DevOps, it's very very, very important. Things like Linux, Python, Docker, they're all open source products that people in this room use every day. One of the things I love doing is reading these yearly developer surveys and reports, things like the Stack Overflow survey. One report on open source is this one called The State of the Octoverse. That's done by GitHub, and it talks about the state of open source in the GitHub communities. So here's a screenshot from the report, and it lists the top 10 open source projects of 2018. And here they've listed it by the number of contributors. So here you can see things that I'm sure a lot of people in this room use, things like Ansible, Kubernetes, even VS Code. And the way that they've defined contributions is not only direct commits into master, but people who have left issues, who have opened pull requests, anything like that. So taking a look at Kubernetes, for instance, a product, again, a lot of people here are familiar with. If you even look at the direct contributions into master, there are over 200 different contributors. There are thousands of issues, pull requests, and the question becomes, how are applications like this able to develop so rapidly? It kind of makes coordinating with 60 people seem easy. And what I want to do is actually dive into what makes open source or certain open source software so successful. And this, again, could also be a talk on its own. But if you're interested in this topic, I highly recommend you read this book called The Cathedral and the Bazaar. It follows the development story of Linux and kind of describes some of what makes it so successful or made the project so successful. It's really interesting, and it's a really short, easy read as well. So for the purpose of this discussion, I do want to focus on just 3 features of successful open source projects. So those are having open collaboration with active participation, having a modular and testable architecture, and having a strong core team. And I'll deep dive into each of these. So when you look at open collaboration, you can take VS Code as an example. one of the cool things about any project that embraces open collaboration is that anyone from any time zone can make a PR, can ask a question, and everything is transparent. Everything is saved, so if any decisions are made, people can just look back on the issues and get context for any decision that's been made. And then there's, in this repo especially, there's a lot of active participation. And one of the questions is, why are people so active on open source projects? And there's many reasons, but one thing that people say is because people are passionate about these topics, whether it be Kubernetes, whether it be a JavaScript framework, whatever it ends up being. People are usually interested in it and passionate about it, and they like having discussion. But if you deep dive further into the repo, you'll see that it's actually really set up for collaboration. There are guidelines. It's also really easy to build and run. Any sort of architectural decisions that are made during releases can all be tied back to a commit, and all the discussion on that issue can be read by anyone. If you look into the actual code base, and you'll see that it's actually really modular. And ultimately what this means is it allows multiple people to contribute to at the same time. And if you look at a lot of other open source or popular open source software, you'll find very, very similar patterns. It's really easy to contribute and make modifications. The other thing you'll notice is that the test coverage is really, really high. This is an example of VS Code. You'll see that in every pull request, every commit into master, there are over 14,000 tests that are run. Looking back at the Kubernetes repo, you'll see that every time you make a pull request, there's up to 21 different test suites that are run. It was really interesting. Last year, I had the opportunity to talk to a Node.js core contributor, and they were explaining to me the crazy amount of test suites that run for Node. They have, the tests running for every type of OS. They have some, major important apps that make sure are run that work with every release. So, testing is a really big thing. And finally, having a strong core team. So speaking of Node, you'll see that they have something called the technical steering committee that kind of guides the overall vision. But a core contributor is also really core contributors are really important for this active participation that I talked about. So, with repos that have thousands of issues, you do need these active core contributors, as well as some automation magic to tag and categorize. But you need people to comment and make sure that the changes that people are suggesting follow this overall vision. So, with all that being said, let's talk a little bit about inner source. So, you may or may not have heard of the term inner source before. So I'll give you a definition. So inner source development essentially takes the lessons learned from developing open source software and applies them to the way companies develop software internally. So if we take the three attributes that I talked about of open source, we can see how it applies to inner source development. So at TELUS, the first inner source project that we actually worked on was what we call the reference architecture. It was kind of our first foray into this world of inner source to see if we could actually do it, if it was for us. And what it is a large wiki, pretty much. It's documentation of all the standards that we agree on. So we wanted to follow this open contribution model. So it's open for anyone to contribute to. And if you're actually interested in it, it is public. So you can go read it and read about our coding standards. But this was really exciting because we kind of just tried it, and a lot of people actually contributed. We had a lot of people who were really passionate about certain topics who just wrote a section of the wiki. And so taking these standards and practices, we started to build what we called the digital platform. And the digital platform is what is the end result now after many years of working on it. But initially, we just started with a few different projects, or a few different products, rather. We took these architectural standards that we had defined in this reference architecture, and we started to create sometimes standards, sometimes actual products like APIs, to following this open contribution model so that anyone can modify it as they see fit. So here's an example of one. The reason I show you this one is because this one is also open. So if you go to our GitHub, you can peruse it and see kind of how we set things up. But this is the project board for TELUS Design System, which is our kind of our UI library. And you'll see that there are issues that get funneled into a to-do, and anyone, anywhere can actually pick it up. They can say, I want to work on this. I want to work on this component. And they will go through design reviews. It will go through a code review, making sure that it follows the architectural patterns, and then it gets merged into our code base. And the modular architecture that I talked about, it has to follow it as well, because you need to be able to easily build, test, deploy it. Otherwise, it'll be too difficult for people to contribute. And of course, we have these core contributors who help manage the repos. They, prioritize what needs to be done. They help steer people in, the direction that the code needs to go in, or, do code reviews. Whatever needs to be done, this is what the core contributors do. The other interesting thing about this is that, as we started to embrace open source in our products, some of the ways that we even approach these products had to change as well. So at the beginning of the talk, I showed you an example of variances we had in our global navigation. So that was solved by a shared API, which we call the Global Elements API. And you have a team that's working on it, and in order to actually successfully roll it out across hundreds of different code bases, you actually needed to have proper release cadences and support schedules and stuff. So it's definitely changing the mindset of the way we build products. In the past, this team would actually build a new version and then try and go to every single team and try and get them to update. But now the onus has actually been reversed. And the Global Elements team, all their responsibility is to continue to develop this product. And the onus is actually on the consumers to make sure that they update in a timely fashion, much like how we consume open source software right now. So, from a product point of view, this is really cool. But what really excites me is how this culture has permeated into our decision-making process. And this is actually where I've seen the real value of inner source. So, as I explained before, when TELUS Digital first started, we followed this center of excellence model where all the specialties were under kind of one group. What was born out of that was a cross-functional team model. And the model that we actually adopted was Spotify's engineering model. And if you want more information about it, you should just Google Spotify engineering model. It's really cool. They have 2 videos on it that really kind of explain it. So the kind of summary of that model is that you have cross-functional teams called squads, which roll up to something called a tribe, which kind of ladder to some sort of business outcome. But then within these squads, you have something called guilds. And guilds can be centered around products, practices, whatever. It's mainly self-forming. Some examples of guilds that we have are SEO guilds, GraphQL builds. And much like how people were super passionate about organizing or contributing back to the reference architecture, people are really passionate about these guilds as well. And they formed into these groups where they talk about SEO best practices, GraphQL best practices. And what's happened is that the decisions that are made in these guilds are done through writing PRs. So this is an example of a PR I opened about a month ago. It was talking about migrating away from Express. So this is a decision that I proposed, and anyone across the company, doesn't matter who they are, can have input on this, the pros, the cons, and whatever the decision ends up being, it's now logged in this pull request. So if a new person joins and they ask, why aren't we using Express? They can either find this themselves, or they can be pointed to this and read all the discussion that led to making this architectural decision. The question becomes, is inner source right for me, or for any of you who are considering adopting it? So there are a couple of questions that you should ask before you deep dive into trying to adopt inner source for yourself. The first question to ask is our culture open and transparent? With the open source model, everything that you do is publicly available for everyone to see. And even if you follow that same principle internally, you'll still have people inside your company who have access to see everything that you've done. So if your company is not okay with this, that's the first thing that needs to be shifted, because in order for this to be successful, you really need a transparent culture. Also, the second question is, do you develop consistently, either on a single platform or to a single standard? It's not impossible to follow open source with a wide variety of standards, but it is much more difficult. And if you want consistency, if you want reuse, if you want sharing, you have to set some standards. The third one I think is probably one of the most important is, are you well resourced? Or do you have any strict deadlines? One of the disadvantages of following inner source, and this is why we actually don't follow it for every single product, is that it is slower. It takes time to submit a pull request. It takes time to get it reviewed and then assign it to someone and then have it go through that process of finally being launched. So if you have a strict deadline and you have to launch something in a month, it's probably not the best approach for you. However, that's not to say that you can't start off in a closed source model and then migrate it to inner source afterwards. And the other ones, yeah, do you have experience contributing to the open source community? Do you practice continuous integration and deployment? Because, like I said, testing is really, really important. And if you don't have those practices, you may not be successful. But let's say you answered, even if you answered no to all of them, and you do want to start moving towards this culture, how can you do that? I would say the first thing to do is to introduce this culture of transparency. For open collaboration to be successful, team members have to be open to criticism, to their code, and their discussion as well. And you don't have to go straight into code. One of the cool things these days is, with communication tools like Slack or Microsoft Teams or whatever tool that you use internally, you can have all these discussions and have it open for people to read. But what's really important if you do use these tools is to make sure that your channels are public. I know that people have a tendency to start a group and they say, oh, this is just for team discussion. I can just make it private. But you really see through the open source model how much context is encapsulated in these discussions. And sometimes if you're new, you may not have great onboarding docs, but you could search through Slack and see what conversation someone had on a certain topic and get all the context through that. Second, solidify your testing practices and coding standards. It'll make things a lot easier to implement when you implement these inner source practices. And then finally, architect your software for collaboration. If you want people to collaborate, it does need to be modular. It needs to be easily runnable on your computer. You need to make it open for collaboration. But with all that being said, we've seen great success, and my recommendation to you is if you want to try this out, start with something small. Maybe it's coding standards, maybe it's a small product, but what you'll find is that as soon as you have this self-sustaining model of code being contributed to, rather than having one team manage that entire process, you will be able to scale. Thank you.